Welcome to the Libertarian Conservative Group podcast, the show that discusses everything from a libertarian conservative twist. I'm James, and today we're talking about the English Democrats with Robin. On today's show, we have another instalment of Meet the Party. I'm joined by Robin Tilbrook, leader of the English Democrats. How are you doing?
Hello, James. Nice to be here. Happy St. George's Day.
Happy St. George's Day to you too. How are you coping at the moment in the lockdown?
Well, I think it's difficult for everyone, isn't it? Really, to deal with all the restrictions on our freedoms that have been imposed. It seems really, certainly one of the explanations we've been given is that the government panicked into it.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, I've got somebody ringing in. I've taken the phone off the hook, but unfortunately, eventually it will start making the off the hook noise.
Okay.
Yeah, the lockdown is causes all sorts of difficulties. I mean, obviously today on St. George's Day we would normally do not only we're not only celebrating it, but also it's an opportunity to make ourselves felt as the only operating English nationalist party. Just as an example, we were intending to have a widespread distribution of an English patriotic newspaper, but of course that's been made really quite difficult to do with what's happened. Not only are all the logistics of getting things quite messed up, but also all the various events that would normally take place for St. George's Day have been cancelled.
Same here, not so much St. George's Day, but of course everything that we do has been thrown into the air. So it is what it is. I say this in every episode, should you be listening for the first time. I intend for all questions to remain the same for each party, with a few variations to suit the preferences. So I will start with the easy one. What is the history of your party?
Yeah, so if we think back to the late 1990s, you remember that at that point there was the Blair government came in, and one of the things that it committed to was having a referendum for Scots and Welsh to have their own parliaments, First Minister and governments, and the odd thing really in that debate was that nobody was sticking up for England at all, and the Conservatives, so-called Conservatives under Major then, were basically trying to say that the thing that they needed to do was save the Union, and I think by that with Major you probably meant not only the Union of the United Kingdom but the Union of the EU. But we then end up having the referendum, and the Scots voted by a significant majority for their own parliament, and that was duly created. We also had there was also a referendum in Wales, which very narrowly won support for a Welsh parliament. And that was also created. But what was then being discussed was breaking England up into regions, into the 9 regions. The Conservatives had actually created the regions under following Maastricht, the Treaty of Maastricht, what happened was that Labour then adjusted the boundaries of those regions, so they became more dominant. Labour became more dominant within the various regions, so they managed to make it so that they got both the northwest and northeast as permanently Labour. And there started to be talk about breaking England up into the regions, and you started to get people like Gordon Brown talking about the nations and regions of Britain. And by nations, he meant Scotland, Wales, and rather peculiarly, he also meant Northern Ireland, because of course most people wouldn't think Northern Ireland was a nation, but that's what he meant by it. And the regions were England. There was and still is, an organisation called the Campaign for an English Parliament, which had been campaigning about having an English Parliament, obviously. And basically where they got to was they'd spoken to quite a lot of the key decision makers in both parties, and been told that they fully understood what was being said, but they didn't intend to do anything about England. In fact, some particularly conservative people came back saying that they thought the most important thing to do was to maintain the Union, and therefore any talk about England was unhelpful. So I and a number of others thought that really that wasn't good enough. We needed to have an English nationalist party that was actually going to stick up for England. And for, I should think, 15 years from our launch back in 2002, we were campaigning for, on the basis of a Parliament for England with a First Minister and government, with at least the same powers as the Scottish ones within a federal UK.
Yeah.
What we were then finding was that, over time, was that basically people who didn't want to do anything for England were then saying things like, England's too big and it needs to be broken up, and therefore we can't have our own parliament. They were also saying that really the important thing to do was to maintain the union. So in effect, they were posing the question about what to do for England as being a sort of binary choice between either breaking England up or breaking up the UK. And obviously, as English nationalists, we feel that the most important bit, as it were, of our national identity is England rather than Britain. Britain was a later bolt-on. England's existed more or less on its current borders since 927, whereas Britain and the UK has only existed arguably 1707, but the union with Ireland was 1801.
Yeah, definitely.
So they're quite later. It's quite a later bolt-on.
Yeah.
And the Constitution itself is primarily English. Whenever you get any discussions, like we did with legal discussions, like we did with Gina Miller and the various Brexit cases, including our own one, you would get into discussions about English constitutional history, like the Lord Chief Justice Coke and his decisions back in the time of James I, talking about the English common law. You've got the English Bill of Rights in 1689. You've got the English Magna Carta.
Yeah.
What you haven't got is any United Kingdom entity existing prior, at any rate, to 1707, when it was the United Kingdom of Great Britain that was created, in a slightly peculiar way, if you think about it, because unions normally mean that the entity then becomes a single union, a single entity. Whereas what happened between the Kingdom of Scotland and the Kingdom of England in 1707, if you look at the Act of Union, what it did was it created a union parliament, and the Scottish MPs and lords were able to sit in the English parliament.
Yeah.
It closed down the Scottish parliament, but it didn't create any union between the churches. It didn't create any union between the education systems, and it didn't create any union, most importantly of all in the modern world, of legal systems. The Scottish legal system is based upon Roman law, and the English legal system is based upon the common law.
So ultimately, it's fair to say then that the premise of your party is to represent England in a fairly unbalanced union of nations.
That's right. Yes.
So I did have a question, the fundamental values of your party, but I think that has been covered there. So
I would just quibble with one thing there. You said a fairly unbalanced union. Our point is that it's an unfairly unbalanced union.
no, that's absolutely fine. Quibble accepted.
Because it does have an impact not only on the pure politics and constitutional structure, but it has an impact that really matters in terms of the way people are looked after. Under the Barnett formula at the moment, we've got about approximate figures, about £2,000 less being spent on every man, woman and child than is spent on people in Scotland. And the different nations have different amounts of money spent on them, but they're not spent in accordance with need. They're spent in accordance with a formula which is based on how much is spent in England. So there's a fixed formula, which means that more is spent in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. For every pound that's spent in England, there's that much more spent in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. The last time there was a proper study done of the Barnett formula by any official body was by the House of Lords back in 2009. And Lord Barnett himself took part in this, but he'd been long calling for the Barnett formula to be got rid of because he thought it was grossly unfair. But what they showed there was that the English taxpayer was basically subsidising Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to the tune of £49 billion a year. It'd be considerably more now, particularly under the lockdown rules, because basically every pound that's spent in England, you get that much more spent in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So if there's a lot of extra subsidies coming through as a result of lockdown, which there certainly will need to be, otherwise we'll wind up with no economy at all, then that extra money has also got to be given to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in the normal formula with the Barnett formula. What that actually means is that the English taxpayer is subsidising subsidies, very generous subsidies, to other parts of the United Kingdom. And if you think about it, we don't seem to get much thanks for that. Far from it. We seem to get not only the bill, but also the blame.
Yeah. So it's just inherently then a very unfair system for the English, at least, anyway.
It is. And part of the reason why the English NHS is struggling to cope with the coronavirus epidemic is because the money has been more generously spent in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland on health, on all the various devolved issues. Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish governments are able to be a lot more generous because they get English subsidies to do so.
Yeah, whilst we only have ourselves to pay for it.
Exactly.
So I want to move on to Brexit, if that's all right. Mm-hmm. And I say this as with things as they currently are, Brexit has taken a bit of a back burner, you could say. How do you see things developing at the end of this year? Do you think we will be leaving, or do you think there will be an extension? Sorry.
Well, of course, I hope that we will leave.
Definitely.
And I'm totally up for us leaving without any deal at all. If that seems to me a much better bet than us dragging on, paying in, and not actually getting any benefit from what we decided to do. What's beginning to seem like a lot of years ago now.
Yeah.
But the thing is, under the coronavirus emergency legislation, the only entity which has any power to decide what will happen later this year about the EU is the government.
Yeah.
I think it's not widely understood, but it should be, and people should be alarmed, that the government chose, once it had switched from the long-established measures that had been planned for many years ago for pandemics, because they do occur from time to time. When they switched from that to their sort of supposed panic measures, we wound up with the Coronavirus Act. And the Coronavirus Act is actually very far-reaching legislation, which closes down all sorts of civil liberties, which I think most of us had thought were actually part of our constitution, and not something that the government had any right to close down. But it did so in such a way that there's almost no power left to Parliament to intervene in anything that ministers want to do, except every 6 months they get the chance to vote on a continuance of the Coronavirus Act regime. But what that's meant, for instance, is we're not going to have any elections now, certainly until May next year. And it is worth reflecting how that fits in with our history, because actually back in 1918, when we were hit with a far worse epidemic than this current one, the Spanish flu, and in the United Kingdom, more than 250,000 people died from that. But right in the middle of this pandemic, which was killing 50 million people worldwide, the Spanish flu pandemic, we had a general election. Basically, the view was, we just got to get on with it.
Carry on. Keep
calm and carry on. Yes, that was a fairly sort of traditional saying, really, of the way things ought to be. But instead of that, what we've wound up with is this coronavirus legislation act, which has allowed the government to slip through various little projects that they've got. I'll give you one. The Christian Concern people have pointed out that the government were trying to slip through, unnoticed by anybody, a massive change to the abortion law to make it far easier to have abortions, not only in the early stages, but also far later into a pregnancy, and with far fewer restraints on that. And that was being done. So in other words, there's a major change to abortion law occurring through the back door without any scrutiny. And it's really only due to their efforts that there has been any scrutiny of it at all. But I don't know if you'd heard of it. But the fact that you haven't heard of it would tell you that there hasn't really been any democratic debate about it.
Well, it's not been in the mainstream media, just like a lot of things. HS2's been just popped through,
I know.
without any due consideration of
and also the legislation,
colossal waste of money it is.
That's right, and also the legislation for the Huawei G5 was also popped through without, whilst people's attention's focused on something else, the government's doing the usual bury the bad news type of operation.
Well, this is one thing
where they're getting all sorts of things through without there being any democratic oversight of it.
Well, this is the one thing that concerned me about the lockdown, and when I was trying to explain to people what my position was on it, this whole legislation, they weren't grasping it, and I think that's because the media has done a very good job at whipping up fear. And when people are afraid, they don't think, if you get what I mean by that.
I do. You're absolutely right. I mean, there has been a massive whipping up of fear. I think you're possibly being slightly kind to the government, because the government itself has certainly had a big role in whipping up fear. I mean, you've only got to look at one of their adverts. It's quite clearly all about saving lives and be safe and all that sort of thing, and this sort of looming threat to us all. Whereas you see, the thing is that the Coronavirus Act and the restrictions that weren't actually even imposed under that act, they were imposed under the 1984 Act, the Public Health Infectious Diseases Act 1984, Control of Infectious Diseases. That act is the basis for most of the restrictions that we've got. But that actually isn't about any cure for this, or preventing people from actually getting it in the end. All it's about is management of the NHS, which after all is extraordinary. To have problems with managing the NHS's reaction to this, and then to in effect stall the economy entirely.
Well, they're saying, aren't they, that once we return back, it's going to be a drop of about 35% once we return back to, you could say, normal, but that's not going to be likely.
The OBR said that was the case. Office for Budget Responsibility said that it would be that sort of percentage, but actually the Bank of England has just come out with a cautionary comment, which they think it's going to be even worse.
Well,
and I think they're probably right, rather than the OBR. The OBR is probably more in the pocket of the government.
Well, I've not seen the Bank of England figures yet, so that's the only reason why I come. What's the word?
But if you OBR, sorry, of all of our experience, I mean, what most small businesses, and indeed quite a few large ones, operate very close to the margin of whether they can carry on or not.
Yeah.
If you knock them off there, so they haven't got the cash flow, what they do is go bust. And whichever area of the economy you turn to, there are already signs that a lot of enterprises are going bust. In the high street, a lot of shops are going. Even in my area of work of being a solicitor, it's thought that most of the firms who deal mainly or exclusively with conveyancing will go bust. Because the fact is, they worked on very tight margins. They made very little profit on each deal, but they needed a lot of deals to go through in order to keep going. And of course, now that that's completely stalled, these firms are going bust.
Definitely, it's concerning. That's all I can say. It's just concerning, but people are not thinking of this right now. They're thinking of the good old mantra. Stay home, protect lives, save the NHS. But as I pointed out on previous podcasts I've done with other people, if we're having to implement such measures to protect the NHS, surely it's a failed system to begin with.
Well, I mean, I live in Essex, and in Essex, so I'm told, a lot of the management of the NHS have basically decided to stay home throughout the whole crisis. So far from being on the front line, a lot of them have decided to be missing in action. There was a report yesterday that the army, who've got involved in trying to help, have got more and more frustrated with just how dysfunctional the NHS's purchasing system is. It's not really. I think the thing is, first we get when people talk about the NHS, we get firstly the issue that relates to what I was talking about earlier about England, because actually the only bit of the NHS that the British government and British cabinet have got control over is the English NHS. Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, they are run by their own governments. In our case, because there is no system for representing England, we got Matt Hancock, who is a member of the British cabinet, as our health secretary. But whenever he's talking about things or reporting or being reported on what he said, you'd be forgiven for thinking that when he refers to our country, he meant the UK rather than just England. And very often they slip into talking about the British NHS and the British system. But so the English NHS was in any case underfunded by comparison to the other ones, but it's also very bureaucratic, and there's all sorts of different structures which don't really quite fit with each other, and you're not quite sure who's got control of any sort of aspect of it. I mean, I'll give you a quite straightforward illustration of just how bad NHS management is. So, I mean, if you are a manager of a team of people, you would expect in a normal business to have the powers of hire and fire.
Yeah.
And if you haven't got that, you actually haven't got anything other than sending them a note or trying to persuade them to get them to get the people who you're supposed to be managing to do whatever it is that you're trying to get them to do. So in other words, you're left with persuasion only. But that is the situation in the NHS. Managers, so-called managers, do not have any disciplinary powers over people that they're working with. It then has to go, if there's any problem with a person, it has to go through a very bureaucratic HR process. And the NHS makes a lot of work and a lot of hassle and a lot of mistakes through that system. And I think the proof of the pudding is, as they say in the eating, that actually a large proportion, a disproportionately large proportion of all the cases that are brought in the courts about employment law relate to the NHS, because the NHS not only makes a mess of dealing with employment law, but it also is completely shameless about spending public money on fighting even the most hopeless cases in order to try and wear down anybody that brings a case against them.
So I think I'm going to move on. I don't want to get bogged down on coronavirus. The only reason I say that is because it's in the news 24/7. So, you just don't want to hear about it constantly.
Yeah.
So, going back to yourselves, the English Democrats, so one thing that struck me when I was reading your manifesto was Monmouthshire. And it struck me because, I'm not going to lie, I was never aware of any sort of dispute with Monmouthshire. So, could you advise why the English Democrats are writing policies for what is right now a Welsh county?
Well, because up until 1974, Monmouthshire was part of England, and had been for many centuries. Arguably, right back to before the Norman Conquest, but certainly since 1536. The fact is, there was no proper discussion about the transfer. It was done very by sort of parliamentary shenanigans rather than by as a result of a public campaign or public support for it. At the time, it didn't really people didn't really notice it because it didn't actually make any great difference, because both England and Wales were being ruled in very much the same way through the same systems of Parliament and local councils and so on. But then when you've got the creation of the Welsh Assembly, you do wind up with differences starting to occur. And the thing about Monmouthshire is, of course, the large proportion of the population in Monmouthshire were English. And now, of course, if you go to a school in Monmouthshire, for example, you're going to find yourself required to learn Welsh. I've got no objection to people learning Welsh, but I think I'd object to my child being required to learn it.
Especially when you're English.
Yes, I mean, if you want to learn it, fine, no problem at all. But to be told that you've actually got to learn it, I think that just shows that the balance in the way things are moving has changed, and it's changed on a national basis, so that you've got the whole drive towards having a more assertive Welsh nation. I'm fully supportive of that, and in fact critical of Clyde Cymru, who really aren't really doing much of a job as nationalists. They are very much left-wing internationalist Europhiles, rather than patriots. But the fact is, there is a debate to be had about Monmouthshire, and it seems to us that the proper way of resolving that is in fact to have a referendum. And so what we've campaigned for is that there should be a referendum of the people of Monmouthshire to decide whether they want to be in England or Wales.
Perfect. I'm not going to lie, I didn't know anything about Monmouthshire, and if I can assume that it might be right that a lot of the listeners won't be either, so it's why I brought it up, basically.
It's quite funny, actually. I did an interview with BBC Wales some years ago, and the BBC reporter, the guy who's conducting the interview, he'd had somebody ring in and say during the interview that basically anybody in Monmouthshire who voted to be in England, that they should have their houses burnt down.
Wow.
Which I thought was absolutely extraordinary, that the BBC would in effect, and this guy repeated this several times during the course of the discussion, the BBC would be sort of in effect condoning a threat to burn down people's houses if they were to exercise a democratic vote to decide which country they were going to be in.
Yeah.
And the thing is that the position of Wales has been moving more towards independence. I mean, I'll just give you for instance. There is now a campaign in Wales to have Welsh law as being completely separate from English law. You're probably aware, James, that the United Kingdom had got 3 legal systems. There was never such a thing called British law.
No.
There was English and Welsh law, there was Scottish law, and there's Northern Irish law, which had originally been, of course, the whole kingdom of Ireland, their law. And the Irish law the Southern Irish law is actually more similar to English law than to Scottish law, because it's another system that's based on common law. But the Welsh government wants to move to a situation where Wales splits from England and has its own separate legal system. And there's some sense to that, because of course the Welsh government and Parliament are passing laws which mean that what you do in Wales is gradually changing from what you would do in England on a number of issues.
Okay. Well, at least now we can at least determine, of course, that you are a party that believes, I hope I've got this right, that we should all be separate independent nations.
Yes, that's right.
I'm glad of that, because bar the Libertarian Party in the UK, I wasn't aware at the time. Granted, I've been doing my digging and research for a while now, and that's how we originally got into contact with each other. But to anyone who would view themselves as a unionist or votes for unionist parties, how do you think you could approach them and convince them why being independent nations would be better for us than a union of a misaligned amalgamation?
Well, of course, we are. Our fundamental argument is that there is only the choice being presented to us by the British political establishment of either breaking up England into some form of regionalisation, or the breakup of the Union in the United Kingdom. The Union of the United Kingdom wasn't created because people wanted it, ordinary people wanted it. It was created as a sort of power block to enable the establishment of the day to be more successful in the sort of European imperialist power system that was occurring. It's not an accident that the first Act of Union of 1707 occurs during the wars with Louis XIV of France, and the second Act of Union with Ireland occurs in 1801 in the wars with revolutionary France and Napoleon. So the unions were created not because ordinary people wanted them, but because of imperialism and big power politics and sort of military reasons. Those reasons have gone. We aren't an imperial power. Although I've often had British politicians say to me that the reason why we need to hang on to the Scots is because it enables us to punch above our weight on the world stage. Well,
I don't think it does.
I'm not really in for that. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, what I'd like to see is England become a modern, democratic nation state, situated as we are on the periphery of Europe, as much as possible, minding our own business and getting on with being a modern democratic state. And I'd rather see us think about, say, Switzerland, which where people actually feel it's worth the bother of voting in Switzerland because their vote really counts, and so you very rarely get any election or referendum where you get a turnout of less than 90%. They're usually over 95%. Whereas the idea that we'd ever get anything in England where 95% would turn out to vote for it, it was just crazy. One of the reasons why the establishment got such a shock as it did with the EU referendum was because quite a lot of people who had given up on voting actually turned out to vote.
Yeah.
But even so, we I think only wound up with something in the order of 80% turnout. But in England, we're used to the idea that our votes don't really count.
Well, you end up getting tactical voting.
You do get tactical voting. This is true. I personally, what I tend to experience canvassing is that what's mostly happening is there's a sort of spectrum shift. On the ends of the spectrum, as it were, people don't vote usually. But if they think that the party that they basically support is going to do better, they might turn out to vote.
Yeah.
And the people on the other side who don't think their party is going to turn out to vote don't bother to vote. And the other thing that you'd also find is the actual numbers of people voting in any election. If you look back over the recent years, you'll find that the numbers of people voting in the election for each party, each of the two establishment parties, has remained remarkably constant.
Yeah.
So in fact, you're not getting a big shift of people moving. In the last election, there is an argument saying that perhaps about 5% might have shifted in some of the Labour. Previously, Labour held seats in the Midlands and in the north of England. But the majority of people, Labour lost a lot because quite a lot of Labour supporters didn't turn out to vote.
No, and then on top of that, they had Jeremy Corbyn and their anti-Brexit stake.
Yeah, well, I mean, Jeremy Corbyn certainly had a role in this. I mean, the interesting thing is, of course, what we have wound up with after the Labour leadership elections is Labour's gone even harder for the type of politics which was making it lose contact with the traditional English working class people. That's clear that people whose families have often voted for Labour for generations are, they're mostly quite conservatively minded people. They're patriotic. They do want a welfare state, but they generally want a welfare state that looks after our people first. They don't want a welfare state that's basically the world's welfare state, where anybody can come along and take advantage of, for instance, our NHS, which we've had a lot of. They do not like a lot of what New Labour stands for and what Keir Starmer stands for. Keir Starmer is a multiculturalist. He's not in favour of our culture being treated with any more respect than any culture of any immigrant groups that may have come. he's not somebody who was prepared to do anything very much about the Muslim child rape gangs that were operating when he was the director of public prosecutions. In fact, one absolutely critical decision that he is known to have made on that is that he said that the CPS was not to take any notice of the ethnicity of either the perpetrators or the victims.
Yeah, it's sickening, really. And now to think he's leader of the opposition and people are idolising him as the patron saint of the Labour Party.
I was amused actually to read that his Christian name Keir is based on Keir Hardie, the one of the key people who at the foundation of the Labour Party. But one of the things about Keir Hardie that the Labour Party people are not so keen on talking about is that the reason he became a public figure is because he was leading the campaign in Glasgow to stop Irish immigration into Glasgow and to preserve the jobs of Scots living in Glasgow. So he was an anti-immigration campaigner before he was anything else.
But the Labour Party once were like that. The Labour Party, I'm not saying that being anti-immigration is putting Britain first, but they did have that mentality where the British, the English, the Welsh, the Scottish, whatever, they came before anyone else as being natives of this land.
Yes,
but I think the Labour Party's realised that bringing in immigrants and giving them all the access to the system is an election win for them, because you can definitely guarantee their votes. It's like with the Democratic Party in America.
It is. The interesting thing actually is that Labour is on the same trajectory as the other so-called liberal social democrat parties across Western Europe, because all of them have gone for the same sort of multiculturalist, pro-mass immigration, liberal, progressive lifestyle values, and anti-patriotic, pro either the EU or internationalism.
Yeah.
That doesn't appeal to most ordinary working people of any of the nations of Western Europe, and consequently, those parties that used to have their purpose to represent the working class, instead nowadays, what they really represent is people who work for the state, in various different ways, often quite well paid. It seems, Keir Starmer being quite a good example, as Director of Public Prosecutions, earning, I think, more than the Prime Minister gets paid.
Most of people working for the public sector earn more than the Prime Minister, especially in the managerial positions.
Quite a few senior people do, yes, including senior people within the NHS, of course. So they represent those people. They also represent people that are on benefits, and they represent migrants.
Yep.
And they represent some other sort of minority interests. So I mean, one of the reasons why we've got a gay pride system in England is because Labour set it up so that that was entirely state funded, and so when we won our mayoralty in Doncaster, what we found was that the Gay Pride March for Doncaster there was no public money, there was no private money put into it at all. No businesses put any money into it. It had no membership or subscriptions or anything like that. The money came from the public pocket, but various different little bits of the public pocket. So in broad terms, it cost about £12,000 to mount the event annually. And there was a team of people who went round the Yorkshire area running these events on different weekends. And for the Doncaster one, about 3,000 came out of the Doncaster Metropolitan Borough Council budget, About 3,000 came out of the police budget for South Yorkshire. About £3,000 came out of the fire brigade budget for South Yorkshire.
Yeah.
And about £3,000 came out of the Regional Development Fund. So as you can see, there wasn't any actual private money for this at all. What our mayor said was that he wasn't going to carry on paying for the Doncaster Metropolitan Borough Council's contribution to this. As far as he was concerned, that there could be a gay pride march, but it had to be funded by the activists.
And that is, I think, a very, at least, moral position to take. I want to move on, if that's all right, unless you've both got anything more you want to add to that point.
No, I just think I think the point, I suppose, is that that's a good example of the way Labour actually operates. It's trying to create voter interest groups, and it's using public money to subsidise what they want to do. Yeah. And that's the sort of payoff between the two groups. One side votes for Labour, and the other side gets and in return they get money from the public pocket.
Yeah. Where do you see the English Democrats in 10 years' time? Where would you hope you'd be as a party?
So what I think we've had over the years is we have made some progress in getting the message out there. I'm not sure it's totally. I'm not sure people are aware of the English question to some extent, and obviously support for things like St George's Day has been building up. But where I think we probably haven't got to a point where we are totally identified with that, although we have actually put out something like 40 million leaflets over the course of our existence. So we have helped to build awareness.
Yeah.
But we need to get to a point where people think any question about England, they think English Democrats. One of our difficulties in doing that at the moment is, of course, that the media literally won't report anything that we would do. They won't report anything that anybody that they disapprove of would do. I mean, I did think it was quite striking that during all UKIP's troubles, when they were having all these problems with various leaders, the media stopped reporting it, even though certainly in the early stages they were still a significant party.
Yeah.
And the media have, as a result of the EU referendum, they have basically utterly given up on any pretense of being impartial or willing to report basic facts. They're just propaganda outfits, it seems to me, many of them.
Well, they call it the Biased Broadcasting Corporation for a reason.
Yes, they do. But I can't remember what question you were asking me now, James.
No, it's all right. It's all right. I know it's gone on for quite a while, so don't worry about it. Just where do you hope to see the English Democrats in the future?
So I was trying to sort of explain where we'd come from and what our difficulties were in terms of advancing the cause.
Yeah.
And of course, during the period where we were trying to get Brexit, people were focused on that. I think once Brexit is actually done, the next question really is the English question. And so I'm expecting that to become much more of a high-profile issue. And of course, we are the only party that is campaigning for England to be given fair and proper treatment. And only English Nationalist Party. So consequently, I would expect that we would get far more, as it were, leverage with people, and people would begin to understand what we're trying to achieve, and sympathise. And many would sympathise. You were earlier asking me how I would persuade unionists.
Yes.
Well, some unionists are people who haven't really thought about it. And just sort of assume that English and British is the same thing. Those are the sort of people who, in Scotland and Wales in particular, used to think more or less the same thing about those countries, but have over the last 25 years or so moved much more to a clear view as to whether they're British or Scottish, for example.
Yeah.
That process has also been going on in England. It has actually reached quite a significant proportion of the population, so much so that in the 2011 census, which was the first census where we were actually asked what our national identity is. The interesting thing was that over 60% said in England said that they were English, not British. So, in a sense, I don't necessarily need to persuade the relatively small proportion of people who think they're British only. The people that we might be interested in having a conversation with would be people who think that they're English and British, and perhaps equally so.
Yeah.
Because there is a choice to be made coming up, and they need to start thinking about where they're going to go with that. Are they going to be English, or are they going to be British? And some will come to English, and some will go to British, as has happened in Scotland. But that will be the new sort of division in politics. Politics, people often tend to think that politics is about coming together, and there is something about that in politics. But it's also about division, and it's about where people stand on issues. So, if you're thinking about the question about England, there is a question for people. Are they in the end going to support England existing and our traditional nationality, or are they going to want to see England broken up? I hope people will choose to support England and to want to be English and to assert that, rather than carry on with what seems to be an increasingly long past its sell-by date idea of Britishness.
Yeah. Well, my personal take on it is I can feel the tension brewing. I can see it within my lifetime, at least, that I believe that Northern Ireland will go. Scotland will go. Wales? I'm not too sure. I know their movement is rising, but it's not as potent as the Scottish and the Northern Irish one. But I can see at some point we being 4 separate countries sharing the same geographical location, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So I do believe there is an option for it. And as someone who identifies as a libertarian conservative, that, for me, it's good. We can start localizing everything to ourselves again, suiting policies for our needs and benefits, not for the benefits of everyone else, like Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, who make their own and don't take us into consideration. So I think it'll make a good time in politics.
It will.
That happens.
I agree with you, James, and of course, don't forget that there is a very large pot of money that the English taxpayer is currently coughing up for Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and if they want to be independent, I would encourage them to be so, but it's got to be on a democratic basis.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't want to carry on subsidising them once they've done that, and that would mean that there would be a very large amount of money that we could be spending on things that we need here in England.
Yeah. So all good times to come. One last question, and it's one I always ask every party and about their closest, you could say, competitor party. Now, for you, I wasn't too sure who your competitor party was. I would think it'd be the Conservative Party, but then they're unionist and you're not. And the only other parties that even promote Englishness are that vilely right-wing. It would not even be fair to compare you with them. So
well, you're
I'm
right.
gonna go on.
But there aren't any parties that really promote Englishness,
No,
apart from us.
So dropping the nationalist arguments, what would make the English Democrats different from the Conservative Party?
So, I mean, the Conservative Party one of the things that perhaps I ought to step back a bit. There's a group called the English Labour Network, which has been created primarily by John Denham, who used to be a Labour cabinet minister, an MP, and is now a professor down in Southampton University of a department of English identity and politics. And he has been saying for a long time now that basically Labour's trajectory towards this sort of multiculturalist, leftist, internationalist agenda is something that is not supported by ordinary English people. The Conservative Party have been able to maintain a sort of implied patriotism, and they've done so partly. They've been able to do so partly because of the way that Labour's been going, and by seeming to oppose that, people assume that they're patriotic. Whereas actually, when you sort of drill down into what they're up to, they're not really patriotic at all. They're sort of liberal internationalists, or globalist type figures who basically support the big business operating and corporate business operating in this country, while sort of talking as if that was actually to our advantage. But of course, really, it's not particularly. I could cite a number of instances of that. I mean, one of those, of course, is that the Conservative Party has been almost since the war pretty pro mass immigration. And that's not because it's any use to ordinary people in the country. It's of use to big business, because what you're doing is what they've been doing is they've been increasing the supply of labour by having many millions of people come here, and they've been doing it in such a way that, of course, that means that the price goes down. It's a basic economic concept that if you have the demand for something remaining the same or increasing, and the supply increases more than the demand, then the price goes down. And so basically, Conservatives have been keen to continue with mass immigration because that does actually put more profits into the pockets of big business. And obviously, rich people are also quite inclined to support mass immigration because it means they have to pay less for any services that they might get from people who are not as rich. And it does distort the market, and it distorts it in the interests of one particular sector, which is the area where the Conservatives are hoping to get support. Boris Johnson is a very effective figure for the Conservatives because he talks as if he's patriotic. But when you actually look at what he actually does, he's not. It's perfectly obvious he's not so patriotic. I mean, I'll just give you for instance. The media go on endlessly about his article where he said that he's quoted as having said that the full burqa for Muslim women made them look, ridiculous and like letterboxes. And that's quoted as showing that Boris is this Islamophobe, and he's committed a great crime against political correctness. But what they don't report is that was an article in which Boris Johnson was arguing that Muslim women should be allowed to wear the burqa.
They always distort the meaning of the message when it suits their preference.
So we're having it reported to us that Boris Johnson is standing up. The reverse way of commenting on the way the BBC talks about it is that the implication from people is that Boris Johnson is standing up for traditional cultural things, that people shouldn't wear full-face burqas. but in fact, he was not arguing for that at all. He was arguing they should be allowed to.
Yeah.
And therefore supporting a more Islamic look in quite considerable parts of our bigger cities in England. And that's an illustration of the fact that he's quite an effective and dangerous enemy for anybody patriotically minded, because he cloaks liberal globalism. He cloaks liberal globalism with words that sound, particularly when misreported, as if he might be patriotically minded.
I have had the feeling from him for a while now. I'm not going to lie. I did vote Conservative Party in December. One reason, Brexit. I was that wound up with it, right? And I was like, during the election, you do kid yourself. You're like, he might actually be the man for change. But you know what? 7 days after voting for him, I was like, nah, I made a mistake there. He's a man wearing a cloak. And he is. He pretends to be something he's not, and he's willing to change whichever way the mood sets. He's basically what UKIP did to David Cameron was he managed to turn their direction into going for a referendum because he was scared. Well, Boris Johnson's no different. He will just wag the tail of the dog being the Conservative Party, to meet whichever way it needs to go.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. But the one big additional point that we've already discussed that's got to be considered with Boris Johnson is that he does have not only a large majority in the House of Commons, and therefore traditionally would be somebody who was empowered to do more or less what he wanted.
Yeah.
But in addition, under the Coronavirus Act, he's actually got more or less total control over the whole constitution.
Yeah.
As much as anybody could have, he now has, and so he is in a position that is very difficult to see how to challenge from a political point of view at the moment. The thing we're considering at the moment is about bringing a case to challenge over the coronavirus restrictions.
Well, I would be more than happy to get behind you on that one. I will give you the full support of the Libertarian Conservative Group for that campaign. I was quite happy to see it when you did a legal challenge over, was it Theresa May's extension?
Yes, I did think that was very interesting in a number of respects. One is our argument was very strong in terms of the traditional constitutional law, so much so that we had a retired Court of Appeal judge, Sir Richard Aikens, say that he thought our argument was very strong, and that he thought that we could well get a finding from the court that that we were actually out at the end of March last year.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing was, I'm a solicitor who practices in dealing with litigations. I've often done judicial reviews, and up until very recently, you had to show that you got an argument.
Yeah.
For the court to hear it. But basically, if you got an argument, you would get a hearing from the court. And even if the court initially thought on paper that you hadn't got an argument, you could still call for there to be a hearing, and you could seek to persuade the judge that you had got enough of an argument to get through to have a proper hearing. And I would say, pretty much every time when I've been running a case, we have, even if on paperwork we've not been allowed to go ahead, when we've actually had a hearing, we've then got an order allowing us to go ahead, because as a solicitor, I'm sort of vetting what cases I'm going to bring to make sure that they are cases which I think there's an argument for. And we had a specialist in constitutional law, barrister, dealing with our case throughout. We had a team of a couple of other barristers, including a QC, and they all thought that we got a strong case, but the court refused to hear it. And it turned out that one of the judges who refused to hear it, I think this is probably the explanation really of what's going on there, was a political activist who was a fellow of the European Legal Institute. Now, the European Legal Institute turns out to be a pro-EU and partly funded by the EU institute, whose objective is to work behind the scenes to further deepen and broaden EU law. So a judge that is signed up to that project is put in a position to quash the chances of us being allowed to bring an argument that we were out of the EU even to be heard in court. And I just think that shows that the judiciary have now been penetrated to such an extent by leftist, multiculturalist figures that you can't actually advance sensibly a right of centre argument on almost anything if it's seen as political. And I would just say, another instance of a judge who didn't actually deal with our case, but has obviously got a name for what she did, was Lady Justice Hale.
Yeah.
That judgment about proroguing Parliament was completely contrary to all existing ideas of how the Constitution worked. It was clearly a breach of the Bill of Rights, which is the sort of basic bedrock constitutional document for the English or British Constitution. They basically decided to throw that out without giving any sensible or proper explanation for why they were doing that. They just ducked around the back, really, in terms of coming up with new arguments that didn't have anything to do with anything that anybody had thought was the Constitution. And of course, why did she become a justice? Well, the answer to that is that the Judicial Appointments Commission, which was set up by Blair and Faulkner and Irvin and so on, all the New Labour activist politicians, it says that basically you can't even get beyond the first stage of applying unless you can demonstrate a lifetime's commitment to equality and diversity. Well, equality and diversity is, of course, the official contradiction in terms, which actually is their sort of way of saying a multiculturalist. So unless you can basically show that you are a multiculturalist, you can't become a judge and you can't get promoted within the judiciary. And Lord Irvin made a speech saying that he set this up to make sure that nobody with reactionary views could be appointed or promoted within the bench. And so that's the explanation of why so many judges are so obviously left-wing figures. And are no longer in sympathy with any of the laws or ideas of how our country should be run from a legal point of view.
Well, I think that's a good point to end that on. Do you have any other points that you'd like to add to the podcast that I might not have brought up or you might not have added when discussing?
Well, obviously, I'm keen to encourage anybody who supports what we're trying to achieve to join the party. But I'm sure you'd expect me to say that.
That's absolutely fine. I'm more than happy for you to do so. It's the reason why I invited you on. As you know, I want to work with all the small parties that at least we agree on the same mindsets, even if we have a different way of doing it. So, and I do not like the big parties who think that they hold the ultimate position and no one else should consider the smaller parties. So I'm more than happy for you to plug yourself.
Thank you, James. I think one of the things, the difference between the smaller parties and the two establishment, well, I suppose two and a half establishment parties, is that the small parties tend to be people who are actually, they are committed to what they're trying to do. They believe in their cause. Whereas the establishment parties are vehicles for getting elected.
Yeah, their only job is winning votes. Now, that's the job of every party. Let's not beat around the bush on that.
No, that's
but
right.
Ultimately, they're like a corporate company that's ultimate job is to win votes. They run it as if they were a company trying to do a takeover bid for another company every 4 years.
They do. I've often said I think it's a bit of a sort of Punch and Judy show, really. I mean, it's basically the same actors behind the thing. There are some people out there on the stage looking as if they're having a fight, but it's not really as much of a fight as it's made out to be. No. And in fact, I had a rather good story illustrating exactly how this works. The mayor of a town in Suffolk, Lady Mara, she one of our activists was talking to her, and as the discussion went on, he was basically noticing that she was supporting everything that Jeremy Corbyn was about, which he thought was a bit odd because she'd been elected as a Conservative councillor. And so he said, well, I thought you were elected as a Conservative councillor. She said, well, yes, I did, but I wanted to be elected. And of course, in this town, if you want to be elected, you have to stand as a Conservative. If I'd been standing for election in my hometown of Liverpool, then I would have stood as Labour and got elected as Labour.
There's the argument that's what Tony Blair did. He weighed up Conservative Party versus Labour Party and decided Labour Party would be the better option in 1997.
Yeah, well, that could be right, but it's certainly whatever. There was at that point not much difference on many issues between the two parties. In fact, I remember a BBC political correspondent saying that he thought that something like 95% of all policy areas the two establishment parties were in total agreement on. And then what they did was most of the remaining 5% were very peripheral things. And what they did was they sort of manufactured artificial sounding disputes between them. Where it looked like there was a difference of policy or what have you, but in fact, actually, there wasn't much difference in the end. I mean, we saw quite a good example during the last general election, in fact, where Labour were saying that there should be we should basically give we should change the immigration law to allow all those people who were here to have the right to remain.
Yeah.
And Boris Johnson and co, they made a great fuss saying that was rewarding illegality and so on. And at the end, in a rather sort of quieter voice, they said that what they were going to do was they were going to grant an amnesty to everybody that was here. So basically, both policies were about allowing everybody to stay here. There was just a different label that they were arguing about.
A way to convince the working northern voter that they weren't pro-immigration when they actually
and of course the interesting thing was that the Conservative offering of the amnesty was said towards the end of quite a long sort of
waffle.
Yes, sort of very, very sort of patriotic sounding waffle. But many people wouldn't listen to right to the end. And so they wouldn't have picked up that actually they were being offered a policy that was more or less exactly the same effect as the Labour one.
Yeah, it's bad times, that's all I'm going to say. I think this would be a good point to end the podcast on. I have enjoyed it. I'm not going to lie, Robin. It has been a great discussion. I would like to thank Robin for coming on today, representing the English Democrats. If you want to learn more about the English Democrats, you can go to their website, which is englishdemocrats.party. I have really enjoyed talking to you, and I wish you and your party all the best.
Thank you very much, James.
I would also like to thank everyone who has been listening to the Libertarian Conservative Group podcast. Before we go, I'd appreciate it if our listeners have enjoyed our podcast to hit like, press subscribe, and until next time, goodbye.